On a quiet Thursday evening in early November 2016, emergency dispatch in Port Macquarie, New South Wales, received 3 calls within the span of 11 minutes. The first came from a panicked neighbour reporting a woman covered in blood stumbling across his driveway. The second was from the victim herself, a young doctor named Angela J., whispering instructions on how to compress her stab wounds while paramedics rushed to the scene. The third call, logged at exactly 6:47 p.m., came from the man who had just tried to kill her. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he described in chilling detail what he'd intended to do. Make love to her, strangle her, douse her body in gasoline, and set her ablaze so she would never belong to another man. This is the story of how a 6-week online romance spiraled into a nightmare of obsession, violence, and a desperate fight for survival. A case that would expose the deadly failures of Australia's domestic violence protection system and force a nation to confront the invisible epidemic, claiming the life of one woman every single week. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Angela J. was born in California in the late 1980s, the eldest of 2 daughters, in a family that valued education, independence, and ambition. Her parents, both Australian expatriates, had built a life in the United States, but when Angela was still a child, they made the decision to return to their homeland. The family settled on the central coast of New South Wales, a picturesque stretch of Australia known for its beaches, tight-knit communities, and slower pace of life. Angela thrived there. She was a diligent student, curious and empathetic, the kind of young woman who seemed destined for a career in caregiving. After graduating high school with honors, she pursued a degree in reproductive medicine at a regional university, driven by a singular ambition: to help bring new life into the world. By 2016, at the age of 27, Angela had achieved that dream. She was working as an obstetrics and gynecology intern at a hospital in Port Macquarie, a coastal city about 400 kilometers north of Sydney. Her patients adored her. Colleagues described her as meticulous, warm, and deeply committed to her work. She had recently emerged from a difficult chapter in her personal life. Her marriage to a naval officer named Ben had ended after several years. The victim of long deployments, conflicting schedules, and the inevitable drift that comes when 2 people are pulled in opposite directions. The divorce had been amicable, but it left Angela feeling unmoored. She was ready to start over, to find someone who could match her energy and her vision for the future. Like millions of others in her generation, she turned to a dating app. The app was one of the popular platforms of the mid-2010s, designed to facilitate connections through photos, brief bios, and the swipe of a finger. Angela's profile was simple: a few pictures from work events and beach outings, a short description emphasizing her love of medicine and the outdoors. Within days, she began receiving messages. Most were forgettable, but one man stood out. His name, according to his profile, was Paul Lambert. He was 36 years old, handsome in a conventional way, tall with a strong jawline, dimpled cheeks, and a confident smile. His photos showed him dressed well, often in tailored shirts or casual outdoor gear, and his bio suggested he was successful, financially stable, and ready for something serious. What set him apart, though, was the intensity of his interest. He didn't just swipe right on Angela's profile. He liked every single one of her photos, a gesture that signaled deliberate attention. For Angela, who had spent months questioning her own desirability after the divorce, the gesture felt validating. She responded to his message, and their conversation quickly took on a romantic tone. Paul Lambert, as he presented himself, was a man with a story. He told Angela he was an insurance agent working at a motorcycle dealership in Sydney, about 300 kilometers south of Port Macquarie. He claimed to have been married once before, a relationship that had ended in heartbreak, and he spoke with apparent vulnerability about the challenges of starting over. He was charming, articulate, and attentive in a way that made Angela feel seen. Their early conversations stretched for hours, covering everything from career aspirations to childhood memories. Paul seemed genuinely interested in her work, asking thoughtful questions about her patients and the emotional toll of the job. He shared stories about his own life, fishing trips with his young nephew, weekends spent hiking in the Blue Mountains, evenings with friends at Sydney pubs. On paper, he checked every box: stable, kind, family-oriented, emotionally available. Their first in-person meeting was delayed for weeks due to the distance between them, but when Paul finally flew to Port Macquarie in late August 2016, he spared no expense. He reserved a table at one of the city's upscale waterfront restaurants, a venue known for live music and intimate lighting. Angela later recalled that the evening began awkwardly. Both of them were nervous, and there were long pauses in the conversation as they struggled to find their rhythm. But after a drink or two, the tension melted away. They talked for hours, discovering shared experiences. Both had been through painful divorces. Both were eager to rebuild their lives. Both believed in the possibility of lasting love. By the end of the night, Angela felt a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. Paul seemed like the real thing. What followed was a whirlwind courtship, marked by grand gestures that seemed almost cinematic in their extravagance. Paul sent flowers to Angela's workplace, not once but repeatedly, often accompanied by handwritten notes expressing his admiration. He learned her work schedule, and when she traveled to medical conferences or training sessions, he would call ahead to the hotels where she was staying and anonymously upgrade her room, paying out of his own pocket for suites with better views or luxury amenities. Angela only discovered this after front desk staff mentioned the changes. The gestures were flattering, even intoxicating. For the first time since her marriage ended, someone was going out of their way to make her feel special. Paul's attentiveness extended to long phone calls late at night, video chats when they were apart, and frequent weekend visits. He introduced her to the idea of a future together, speaking openly about marriage, children, and building a life in Sydney once she completed her residency. Angela's family noticed the transformation in her. She seemed lighter, more optimistic, and eager to share stories about this new man in her life. When she finally introduced Paul to her mother, Susan, her stepfather Bill, and her younger sister Danielle, the meeting appeared to go smoothly. Paul arrived with an enormous bouquet of flowers for Susan, dressed impeccably in slacks and a crisp button-down shirt. He was polite, articulate, and effortlessly charming. Susan was immediately taken with him. She later told friends that Paul seemed like a dream come true for her daughter, a man who was clearly head over heels in love, financially secure, and eager to commit. But Bill, Angela's stepfather, felt differently. Within minutes of meeting Paul, he told Susan in private that something felt off. He couldn't articulate exactly what troubled him. Perhaps it was the way Paul's smile seemed too practiced, or the way his eyes lingered just a fraction too long when scanning the room. But Bill's instincts told him this man was performing, not revealing. Susan dismissed her husband's concerns as overprotectiveness, but Bill's unease would prove prophetic. By the 6th week of their relationship, cracks began to appear. Paul's attentiveness, which had once felt romantic, started to feel suffocating. He began calling Angela multiple times a day, often while she was at work, and grew irritated when she couldn't answer immediately. He demanded to know the names of her male colleagues, questioned why she had stayed late at the hospital, and grew suspicious if she stopped for groceries on the way home. His texts became more frequent, more urgent, often arriving in rapid-fire succession if Angela didn't respond within minutes. He began making comments about their future that felt less like invitations and more like expectations, talking about when, not if, she would move to Sydney, and expressing frustration that she wasn't ready to escalate their commitment. Angela felt the dynamic shifting. The butterflies she had felt early on were replaced by a low-grade anxiety, a sense that she was being watched and evaluated. When she gently tried to create space, suggesting they slow down and take things at a more comfortable pace, Paul reacted with what can only be described as panic. Angela made the decision to end the relationship in early October 2016, roughly 6 weeks after they had first met in person. She did so carefully, choosing her words to be kind but firm. She told Paul she wasn't ready for the intensity he was offering, that she needed time to focus on her career, and that she believed he deserved to find someone who could match his energy. She framed the breakup as a mismatch rather than a failure, hoping to soften the blow. Paul's response was immediate and alarming. Within hours of the breakup conversation, Angela's phone began lighting up with messages. Paul claimed he was devastated, that he couldn't imagine life without her, that she was the only person who had ever truly understood him. He threatened to harm himself, saying he would jump in front of a train or a speeding truck if she didn't reconsider. He told her he had stolen the spare keys to her apartment and implied he would use them to enter her home and end his life there, forcing her to find his body. The messages were manipulative, designed to flood Angela with guilt and fear in equal measure. What Angela didn't know, what no one in her life knew at that moment, was that Paul Lambert was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Paul Michael Scales, and he had a documented history of violence, obsession, and psychological abuse spanning more than a decade. Born in Queensland, Australia in August 1980, Paul Scales grew up in a fractured household. His parents divorced when he was 4 years old, and he spent much of his childhood shuttling between homes. He had an older sister, and after his father remarried, several half-siblings, but by all accounts, Paul struggled to form stable attachments. Friends from his adolescence later described him as intelligent but socially awkward, the kind of person who seemed to be studying social interactions rather than participating in them naturally. He performed well academically and eventually found work in the insurance and sales industries, where his meticulous planning and attention to detail served him well. But in his personal life, Paul exhibited patterns of behavior that would later be recognized as hallmarks of coercive control and borderline personality disorder. By the time Paul Scales was in his early 20s, he had already begun a pattern that would define the next 15 years of his life. He pursued romantic relationships with intensity, showering his partners with attention, gifts, and declarations of love. But once the relationship was established, his behavior would shift. He became controlling, demanding to know his partner's whereabouts at all times, isolating them from friends and family, and reacting with rage or despair to any perceived rejection. When relationships ended, Paul could not accept the loss. He stalked his ex-partners, bombarded them with messages and made threats, sometimes against himself, sometimes against the women or their new partners. Over the course of 13 years, Paul accumulated 10 restraining orders involving 5 different women across Queensland and New South Wales. Each relationship followed the same trajectory: idealization, control, and then obsessive pursuit after the inevitable breakup. In February 2014, Paul married a woman he had known for several years, but the marriage was doomed from the start. Colleagues who knew him at the time said Paul seemed distracted, even during the wedding planning process. Just weeks after the ceremony, he abruptly left his wife, citing vague personal reasons. Friends assumed infidelity, and they were correct. Paul had become fixated on another woman, though he refused to reveal her identity. The marriage limped along for a few months before collapsing entirely. By September 2014, Paul was on a plane to Orlando, Florida, where he had begun an online romance with a 32-year-old Emmy Award-winning television journalist named Brittany Ann Keel. Paul had met Keel through a dating platform, and their initial interactions had been promising. He flew to Florida multiple times, each visit framed as an effort to explore whether they had a future together. But Brittany quickly realized that Paul's behavior was erratic. He was possessive, jealous, and prone to sudden mood swings. After spending just 1 month with him in person, Brittany ended the relationship and asked him never to contact her again. Paul Scales did not take rejection well. In the months that followed, he launched a campaign of harassment against Brittany Keel that would eventually lead to his arrest and deportation. He sent her hundreds of emails and text messages, many of them threatening to expose private information she had shared with him in confidence. He called her employer at the television station, attempting to damage her professional reputation. He fabricated stories about having a brain tumor, knowing that Brittany's father had nearly died from a similar condition and that the topic was an emotional trigger for her. He invented a fictional twin brother named Michael and claimed that both he and Michael had been dating Brittany simultaneously without her knowledge, a bizarre narrative designed to make her question her own reality. When manipulation failed, Paul resorted to extortion, demanding money in exchange for leaving her alone. Brittany Keel, terrified and emotionally exhausted, finally went to the police. In May 2015, Paul Scales was arrested in Florida and charged with stalking and extortion. During court proceedings, his behavior was so disturbing, marked by sudden outbursts, bizarre statements, and a complete lack of remorse, that observers noted clear signs of psychopathy. After spending a month in a federal immigration detention center, Paul was deported to Australia in June 2015, escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals. Upon his return to Australia, Paul Scales legally changed his name to Paul Dennis Lambert, a deliberate attempt to distance himself from his criminal record and start fresh. He moved to Kogarah, a suburb in southern Sydney, and found work at a motorcycle dealership as an insurance agent. But the name change didn't erase his past. He resumed contact with his ex-wife, and when she refused to reconcile, Paul escalated to violence. He ambushed her in her car, punching her in the face and attempting to strangle her before she managed to escape. She reported the assault to police, and Paul was convicted and sentenced to 12 months of probation. One of the conditions of his probation was that he could not leave Queensland without permission from the parole board. By moving to Sydney and taking a job there, Paul was already in violation of his parole, but due to a lack of coordination between state law enforcement agencies, this violation went undetected. When Paul Lambert met Angela J. in August 2016, he was living under a false identity, evading his parole conditions, and already under 10 active restraining orders involving 5 different women. He had refined his tactics over years of practice, learning how to present himself as charming and vulnerable, how to escalate commitment quickly, and how to deploy guilt and fear when control began to slip. Angela, who had no reason to suspect she was dealing with a repeat offender, interpreted his intensity as passion, but within weeks, the mask began to crack. Paul's behavior after the breakup was textbook coercive control. He alternated between pleading and threatening, between declarations of love and warnings of self-harm. He sent Angela's sister, Danielle, a series of messages from a fake account, pretending to be a friend named Dan, who claimed to have witnessed Paul nearly getting hit by a truck. The messages were designed to make Angela believe Paul was suicidal and that she bore responsibility for his death if it occurred. Frightened and overwhelmed, Angela confided in her sister, and Danielle insisted they go to the police. On the morning of October 30th, 2016, Angela walked into the Port Macquarie police station and filed for a civil protection order against domestic violence. The officers ran Paul's name through their database and discovered his history of violence and restraining orders. However, the police assessment at the time was that Paul posed a greater risk to himself than to Angela. They advised her to call emergency services if anything escalated, but expressed confidence that the protection order would deter further contact. The problem was that police were unable to serve the order to Paul himself. He evaded multiple attempts to locate him, failed to appear in court, and continued to operate outside the reach of the legal system. Angela left the police station believing she had done everything right, but in reality, the protection order was a piece of paper with no enforcement behind it. What Angela didn't know was that Paul Lambert was already in Port Macquarie. He had flown back to the city in late October and rented a white Toyota Corolla hatchback from a local car rental agency. The employee who processed the rental later recalled that Paul seemed agitated and nervous, hurriedly loading bags into the trunk. He told the employee he was in town to reconcile with his girlfriend after a fight, that he didn't want things to end badly. It was a lie designed to deflect suspicion. Over the next several days, Paul made a series of purchases that would later be catalogued as evidence of premeditation. He visited a hardware store and bought a utility knife, an axe, and 2 30-meter rolls of duct tape. He stopped at a gas station on November 1st and filled a 5-liter canister with gasoline. On November 2nd, he purchased a sledgehammer and a crowbar. Each purchase was made at a different location, a deliberate effort to avoid arousing suspicion. While Paul was preparing, Angela was doing everything she could to feel safe. She planned to change the locks on her apartment, though she hadn't yet found the time. She began hiding kitchen knives in her bedside table each night, a small measure of reassurance in case Paul somehow gained entry. She had arranged to stay at her sister Danielle's house for several nights, hoping that distance would give her breathing room. What Angela didn't realize was that Paul was watching her. He had booked a room at a hotel directly across from the hospital where she worked, positioning himself with a clear view of her comings and goings. He tracked her schedule, noting when she arrived at work, when she left, and where she went in the evenings. On multiple occasions, he hid in the bushes outside her home, peering through windows to observe her movements. He was building a pattern, studying her routine, waiting. On the evening of November 3rd, 2016, Angela stopped by her house after finishing her shift at the hospital. She planned to feed her cat, eat a quick dinner, and then drive to her sister's place for the night. She was exhausted, eager to complete her tasks and leave. She put her meal in the microwave and walked toward her bedroom to pack clothes for the next day. As she stepped into the hallway, she was attacked. A hand clamped over her mouth, and she found herself staring into the eyes of Paul Lambert. He told her everything was fine, that he just wanted to talk. He led her to the bedroom, ordered her to sit on the bed, and began interrogating her about whether she was seeing other men. Then Paul revealed that he had removed the knives she had hidden in her bedside table and replaced them with items of his own: duct tape, cable ties, and a pair of women's underwear. Angela understood in that instant that she was in mortal danger. She tried to run, but Paul moved faster. A knife appeared in his hand. Angela later recalled that she didn't immediately feel pain. Her body, flooded with adrenaline, registered only a dull pressure as the blade entered her flesh. Paul stabbed her 11 times, targeting her chest, arms, and legs. Then he grabbed the gasoline canister he had hidden in the room and poured it over her head. The liquid burned as it ran into her eyes, ears, and mouth, and Angela realized with absolute clarity what was about to happen. Paul intended to set her on fire, but the gasoline, while intended to immobilize her, had the opposite effect. Her skin, now slick with fuel, slipped free from his grip. In a moment of pure survival instinct, Angela broke away and ran. She stumbled out of the house, bleeding heavily, her vision blurred, and made it to her neighbor Steve's front door. Steve, who had noticed an unfamiliar man in Angela's kitchen earlier that day, heard her screams and rushed outside with a steel rod in hand. When he saw Angela, covered in blood, her clothing soaked in gasoline, he immediately understood she had been attacked. He brought her into his garage and, following her calm, methodical instructions, applied pressure to her wounds. Angela, despite the trauma and blood loss, stayed lucid long enough to guide him through basic first aid, a skill that saved her life. Steve's daughter called the police, and within minutes emergency services were en route. Angela's strength began to fail, and she drifted in and out of consciousness. Steve, panicking, kept asking her questions about her cat, about her family, about anything, just to keep her awake until help arrived. By the time paramedics reached Angela, Paul Lambert had fled the scene. He sped away in the rental car, dialing numbers on his phone as he drove. His first call was to Angela's phone, which Steve answered in the ambulance. Paul asked quietly if she was okay, his voice eerily calm. His second call was to Angela's mother, Susan, informing her in a flat, detached tone that her daughter had been attacked. His third call was to the police emergency line. In a bizarre display, Paul referred to himself in the third person, telling the dispatcher that he, meaning Paul, had intended to make love to his girlfriend, strangle her, douse her in gasoline, and set her on fire so she would never belong to another man. The call was logged at 6:47 p.m., and police immediately triangulated his location using his mobile phone signal. A high-speed chase ensued, with police pursuing Paul north along the Pacific Highway. Officers deployed road spikes approximately 150 kilometers from Port Macquarie, shredding the tires of the rental car and forcing it to a halt. Paul emerged barefoot, wearing shorts and a sweater, holding a knife. Police attempted to subdue him with a taser, but the device failed to incapacitate him. Paul waved the knife and shouted for officers to shoot him, advancing toward them in what appeared to be an attempt at suicide by cop. When he lunged at one of the officers with the knife raised, 2 other officers opened fire. Paul Lambert was struck by multiple bullets. He dropped the knife, sank to his knees, and collapsed face first onto the pavement. He was pronounced dead at the scene. A search of the rental car revealed a handwritten suicide note in which Paul claimed he was ridding the world of a toxic person, himself. He wrote that despite trying to be a good person, his efforts were never enough, and that others would find peace once he was gone. The note suggested premeditation and a carefully constructed narrative designed to frame his death as a noble sacrifice rather than the act of a violent criminal. Police also discovered that while waiting for Angela to return home on the day of the attack, Paul had taken a shower in her house and written the words "I love Paul" on the steamed-up bathroom mirror. He had hidden the fire extinguisher in the bedroom closet, presumably intending to use it after setting Angela ablaze to control the flames and stage the scene. The level of planning was chilling. The investigation that followed revealed a cascade of systemic failures. Just days before the attack, Paul had been pulled over by New South Wales police for speeding and driving with an invalid license. Officers issued a fine but failed to check whether he was in violation of parole conditions, because there was no centralized database linking state probation records. Had that check been performed, Paul would have been arrested on the spot, and Angela's attack might have been prevented. Additionally, the 10 restraining orders against Paul were spread across multiple jurisdictions, and there was no mechanism for law enforcement in Port Macquarie to access the full scope of his criminal history in real time. Angela had done everything right. She had reported his behavior, filed for a protection order, and informed police of her concerns. But the system designed to protect her had failed at every level. Angela J. survived, though her recovery was long and painful. She required surgery to repair the damage from the stab wounds, and the psychological trauma took even longer to heal. She was haunted by the image of Paul's face as he attacked her, the smell of gasoline, the certainty that she was about to die. But Angela also felt an overwhelming sense of relief when she learned Paul was dead. She described the feeling as euphoria mixed with disbelief. She had survived something that should have killed her. For months afterward, she struggled to return to normal life. She couldn't bring herself to go back to her home in Port Macquarie, where the attack had occurred. The blood trail on her driveway, leading from her front door to her neighbor's house, remained visible for days, a reminder of how close she had come to death. Angela eventually returned to work, though she moved back to the city where she had grown up, seeking the comfort of familiar surroundings and the support of her family. Her mother, Susan, was consumed by guilt, replaying that first meeting with Paul and wondering if she had missed warning signs. Her stepfather, Bill, took no satisfaction in having been right about Paul from the beginning. Angela's sister, Danielle, became her fiercest advocate, accompanying her to medical appointments, therapy sessions, and later to public speaking engagements where Angela shared her story. Angela's decision to speak publicly about domestic violence was driven by a painful statistic. In Australia, approximately 1 woman per week is killed by a current or former partner. Angela knew she was one of the lucky ones, and she felt a responsibility to use her survival to help others. In 2021, 5 years after the attack, Angela married Ben Hardy, an orthopedic surgeon she met through her work at the hospital. Ben had been a colleague and friend during her recovery, offering support without pressure, and over time, their friendship deepened into love. Angela described Ben as everything Paul had pretended to be: kind, patient, secure in himself, and genuinely invested in her well-being. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and open communication, the antithesis of the coercive control she had experienced with Paul. Angela credited Ben with helping her reclaim her sense of safety and autonomy, and together they built a life rooted in trust. Angela also became an ambassador for the White Ribbon Organization, an Australian non-profit dedicated to preventing domestic violence and supporting survivors. She participated in fundraising events, spoke at schools and community centres, and worked with legislators to advocate for policy reforms. Her case became a catalyst for change in New South Wales, highlighting the need for better coordination between state law enforcement agencies, more robust enforcement of restraining orders, and expanded resources for victims of coercive control. Angela's message was clear: trust your instincts, seek help early, and don't let shame or fear prevent you from speaking out. She emphasized that coercive control often begins subtly, with small acts of monitoring or manipulation, and that recognizing these early warning signs can save lives. The legacy of Angela J's case extends beyond her personal recovery. Her story exposed the gaps in Australia's domestic violence response system and galvanised public support for legislative reforms. In the years following the attack, New South Wales implemented measures to improve information sharing between state agencies, expanded funding for domestic violence shelters and support services, and introduced public awareness campaigns aimed at educating people about coercive control. Angela's willingness to speak openly about her experience helped destigmatize the conversation around domestic violence and encouraged other survivors to come forward. She became a symbol of resilience, not because she was extraordinary, but because she refused to let her trauma define her. Paul Lambert's death ended his reign of terror, but it also left unanswered questions. What might have been different if his probation violation had been detected when he moved to Sydney? What if the restraining orders against him had been entered into a national database accessible to all law enforcement agencies? What if the police in Port Macquarie had taken Angela's concerns more seriously and prioritized serving the protection order? These questions haunt not only Angela and her family, but also the investigators, social workers, and policymakers who work to prevent similar tragedies. The reality is that Paul Lambert was a known threat, a man with a documented history of violence and obsession, and yet he was able to move freely across state lines, adopt a new identity, and target another victim with near impunity. His case underscores the limitations of restraining orders when they are not backed by enforcement, the danger of fragmented law enforcement systems, and the lethal consequences of underestimating the risk posed by men who exhibit patterns of coercive control. Angela Jay's story is not just a tale of survival, it is a call to action. It challenges society to recognize that domestic violence is not a private matter, but a public health crisis that requires coordinated, sustained intervention. It demands that we listen to women when they say they are afraid, that we believe them when they describe coercive behavior, and that we take action before fear turns into tragedy. Angela's survival was the result of her own courage, the quick response of her neighbor, and a measure of luck. But luck should never be a factor in whether someone lives or dies at the hands of an abusive partner. The system must do better, and Angela has dedicated her life to ensuring that it does. Her voice, shaped by trauma but strengthened by resilience, continues to echo across Australia and beyond, reminding us that the fight against domestic violence is far from over, and that every voice, every story, and every survivor matters in the effort to create a safer world.